us pray. We give thanks to God for the rich heritage of this province as found in our people. We pray that native-born Albertans and those who have come from other places may continue to work together to preserve and enlarge the precious heritage called Alberta. Amen.
Introduction of visitors. Presenting petitions.
Edmonton Goldbar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I present a petition today on behalf of 57 investors and First Investors and Associated Investors of Canada who seek a reconvention of the code inquiry such that the mandate of the inquiry is expanded to empower the inquiry to investigate government liability in the failure of these two companies.
Presenting reports by standing and special committees.
Member for Calgary North Hill.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the report of the Standing Committee on Privileges and Elections, Standing Orders and Printing in response to Government Motion Number 9 in relation to matters dealing with order and privileges of the Assembly.
Notices of motions. Introduction of bills. Tabling returns and reports.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the response to motion for return number 209 and also table reports that are required by statute, annual reports of various educational institutions.
Mr. Speaker, I have the pleasure of tabling the annual report for 1986-87 for the Alberta Heritage Foundation for Medical Research.
Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism.
Mr. Speaker, I have the pleasure of tabling the Alberta Library Report annual report ending March 31, 1987.
Introduction of special guests.
Edmonton Glengarry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce to you and through you to members of the Assembly 41 students from Lorelei Elementary School in the Glengarry constituency. They are accompanied today by 4 teachers, Mr. C. Ross, Ms. Fortin, Mrs. Niskanen, and Mr. Luard. I would ask them to rise in the members' gallery and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
Westlock Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce to you and through you to the members of the Assembly another group of investors in the Principal Group Limited. If they would rise now, we greet them in the customary manner.
Edmonton Millwoods.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to present to you and to the members of the Assembly today 54 students from Greenview School in the constituency of Edmonton Millwoods, which is only 1 block from my home, actually. Very pleased to have with them their 2 teachers, Mr. Don Briggs and Mr. Jerry Medelstad, as well as 2 student teachers, Laurie Bowell and Kathy Wood, and I'd ask them to now rise and receive the warm welcome of the House.
Edmonton Beverly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleasure for me today to introduce to you and to members of the Assembly 15 grade 6 to 12 students from the Agopi Training Center, which is located in the constituency of Beverly. They are joined by their teachers, Mr. Fred and Fred Mork, who is also doubling today as the bus driver. Also joining the students, Mr. Speaker, is a parent, Miss Arlene Beck-Pedersen. Would you please rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly?
Member for Red Deer South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure for me to introduce to you and through you to the members of the Legislative Assembly 14 special guests and friends of mine from sunny Red Deer. They are here with Branch 35 of the Red Deer Legion. I would mention, Mr. Speaker, that a number of these friends have given me some very sound and helpful advice over the years. They are seated in the members' gallery, and I would ask that they rise and receive the warm reception of this Assembly.
My goodness. All of Red Deer today, Red Deer North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to single out a dynamic couple who are here today in the gallery and have been vitally involved in the research and publication of Alberta's most recent historical volume. The Little Village That Grew is the title of it, and it commemorates 75 years of the history of North Red Deer. And Mr. and Mrs. Caton are with us here today. I'd like them to stand and be recognized for the good work that they were involved in there.
Ministerial statements. Oral question period.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to...
Take leave, indulgence for half a moment. Honourable members, yesterday the chair, during the course of question period, was a bit concerned about some of the use of some of the terms that were used with regard to terms that were reflecting upon other members in this House. The chair does not need to remind honourable members that the word honourable imports many things. One of these things is the requirement that members address each other with respect and do not impute false or avowed motives. For this reason, I would caution all honourable members to use more care in the terms and phrases used in debate and adhere at all times to proper use of the English language. I try to use it myself. Yesterday was a bit more difficult for the chair in that the leaders of two of the caucuses represented in the House were the individuals that were involved. And so the chair just gently admonishes the House that locker room talk or colloquial insults neither enhance nor bring respect to the high office which every honourable member finds him or herself in. And the chair sincerely hopes that members will exercise greater care and show more respect for this chamber when addressing each other in future. Honourable Leader of the Opposition, question period, please.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct the first question to the Provincial Treasurer. Mr. Speaker, the Provincial Treasurer has finally admitted what the official opposition has been telling him since last March, that the budget revenues were underestimated, and that this was probably deliberate in the 1987 budget. Mr. Speaker, the government then went on an unprecedented tax gouging of average Albertans to over $1 billion, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Treasurer, is the Treasurer now prepared to recognize the fact that he may have imposed too much in the way of taxes on average Albertans? And I would remind him we had tax hikes, new taxes, flat taxes, and surtaxes all in that budget, Mr. Speaker.
First of all, Mr. Speaker, let it be clear that I do resent the indication that we as a government attempted to mislead the people of Alberta. If that is, in fact, the words that the Honourable Leader of the Opposition referred to, I would hope that he would reconsider those, because there was no attempt at all to do just that, and I don't think he intended that. But with respect to the fiscal plan which we put forward, it should be noted that we are very fortunate in this province to have had an oil revenue increase above what was forecast. This forecast, I think, was debated here. It's interesting to note that there was not unanimity on behalf of the opposition members. One party said it was too high, and the other party said it was too low. We said it was $17. We actually, for the first time, made an estimate as to what the actual forecast would be, and that forecast was very close, as my memory is right, to what the federal government used as well. But in this very difficult time, Mr. Speaker, of course, it's hard to make a forecast, and very difficult to take a risk which would have seen our deficit increase more than it had. And for that reason, we had to take some composite view, which brought together available amount of resources which we have in this province, including the oil and gas sales. We had to ask the people of Alberta to pay a bit more, in reference to the member's question, to still maintain the lowest tax regime in Canada with no sales tax, and at that same time, Mr. Speaker, to maintain the highest expenditure of any province in Canada. I should note, Mr. Speaker, that notwithstanding that, the Conference Board of Canada has picked Alberta's economy to be the strongest in 1988, and that should be a matter of record in the context of our fiscal plan for 1987-88.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure average Albertans would be interested that $1 billion is a bit of a tax credit, Mr. Speaker, just a bit. My question then, in view of the comments from the minister, who he recognizes that we are going to have more revenues, would he then do the proper and the correct thing and return that extra money to average Albertans so they could spend that money and create some employment in this province, Mr. Speaker?
Again, Mr. Speaker, I don't know where the member from Norwood has been in the past 6 months, but clear evidence has been shown that the unemployment rate in this province is reducing down to the lowest level we have seen for the last 3 to 4 years. That is as a result of the fiscal plan, and that clearly follows from the clear importance we have placed on manpower training and certainly the response of the private sector in terms of new capital formation in this province, committed, promised, and now underway. Revitalization is taking place in this province, Mr. Speaker, and new economic growth is ahead.
Mr. Speaker, that's a type of callous answer that the unemployed in this province, and there's thousands of them, Mr. Speaker. That's right. Mr. Speaker, then, let's be crystal clear what this minister is saying. Is he saying that he is not prepared, even though he gouged Albertans unfairly in the last budget, he's not prepared to give a tax discount to any Albertans at this particular time, that they're not going to do anything about this, Mr. Speaker?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're not in the tax discounting business. Mr. Speaker, we're in the business of setting forth a reasonable plan for Albertans, one which takes consideration of the ability of this province to recover from the devastation of 1986 while maintaining a very equitable plan in terms of the expenditure profile, maintaining a profile which shows priority in education, on hospitals, on those people who are not able to pay for themselves, and on job creation. Those are the key thrusts that were in that budget, Mr. Speaker, and it's important that they're put back and on the table right now because it's the context in which we argue. It's a context which set forth a plan which has been accepted by the people of this province. And in that context, Mr. Speaker, it's safe to say our plan is on point. We are moving ahead with this plan, and as I've further indicated, the private sector is responding to this kind of leadership.
Mr. Speaker, yeah. Mr. Speaker, maybe his corporate friends tell him that, but talk to average Albertans about what they've done.
Get a different message, Dick.
Get a different message. You get a different message.
Mr. Speaker, I want to ask this treasurer again. In view of the fact that there may be an extra $500 million there, is he not prepared to lower taxes for average Albertans to stimulate the economy and perhaps create another 10,000 jobs? Is he not prepared to do this, Mr. Speaker?
There is no doubt, Mr. Speaker, that this government will use every economic lever available to it. In terms of stimulating the economy, we're maintaining a very high-profile expenditure, some $11 billion of expenditures taking place in this province, a capital works project which is not matched anywhere in Canada on a per capita basis, and at the same time maintaining the lowest level of taxation in this province. No sales tax, Mr. Speaker, as I've noted, but also a personal income tax regime which has taken more than 500,000 Albertans off the tax rolls. And we have geared our tax regime to be targeted to those people who have less income, and that is the clear plan which we have put across. To say anything else, Mr. Speaker, is not speaking the truth to the people of Alberta.
Edmonton Gold Bar.
Mr. Speaker, to the Treasurer, will the Treasurer at the very least then, under these new circumstances, now undertake to redress the problems caused by cutbacks in education, health care, and so on that have created unemployment, that have caused serious difficulties for Albertans, Alberta institutions, and many of those who work in them?
Well, with respect, Mr. Speaker, it's very difficult to argue that there have been cutbacks in education or cutbacks in health and Medicare. Both of those budgets, as has been debated here, have in fact expanded, Mr. Speaker, and we know that there have been some need to deal with the deficit, and that's been at the heart of that, Mr. Speaker. I should say as well that unfortunately we had to collect 1 year's tax in the 6-month period, and that adjustment will take place on January the 1st, 1988, when in fact the annualized tax impact will work through the system, and there'll be an actual reduction in tax as a result of that. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, it's my understanding that the federal government will introduce a Ways and Means bill which will reflect their tax changes proposed for 1988, which as well will reduce the tax not only at the federal level, but under the current regime at the provincial level as well. So those are now working through, Mr. Speaker, but it should be noted that this economy is responding very well. The new capital formation, new investment intentions are very high, and unemployment, although there is still unemployment in this province, is moving in the right direction.
Member for Little Bow.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the provincial treasurer for clarification, could the minister indicate what would be the intended dispensation of that $500 million? Would it be towards lowering of debt borrowing by the government of Alberta in the current fiscal year, or would it be carried over into the next fiscal year to be applied to various government programs?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's a very, very important point. Let's be clear on one thing, Mr. Speaker, that as all members know, the revenues of this province are a basket of revenues. It's not one item that's going to set in place the profits or losses, if you like, or reduction of the deficit. It's true that the oil prices are up and land sales are up as well, but we should note that gas sales are down in terms of the actual additional revenues, and we do not have a very good number with respect to the corporate tax collections, or for that matter, the personal tax collections. And therefore, it's a bit premature to say that we're going to have some kind of a super reduction of deficit. But should that deficit be reduced, Mr. Speaker, then obviously the province will not have to go to the markets to the extent that we need to under our forecast, and therefore our borrowings would be down. And eventually, Mr. Speaker, because this government has put forth a fiscal plan which shows how we will move between now and 1990, 1991, one which set forth a policy to reduce the deficit, one which shows our intention to do just that. Then, of course, we would, if we had any additional surpluses or any significant surpluses generated by other unforeseen revenues, that would go to reducing the outstanding debt, Mr. Speaker, and that's been the commitment we've made, and I think generally that's been the suggestions given to us by the people of Alberta.
Second main question, Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to designate my second question to the member from Edmonton Highlands.
Mr. Speaker, with respect to the Principal fiasco, on Monday of this week and then again yesterday, the Premier made reference to the government's expenditure of, quote, millions and millions and millions of dollars on behalf of the investors. Now, one recent special warrant, Mr. Speaker, gave $2 million to the Code Inquiry to conduct its investigation, and another $200,000 in my reading to the Ombudsman to conduct his investigation, the total of which comes to $2.2 million. Now, I'd like to ask the Provincial Treasurer, as the keeper of the public purse, can the Provincial Treasurer advise whether or not this $2.2 million is the total amount referred to by the Premier this week in terms of the government's assistance to the investors in this matter, or is there more money, and if there is, where, that is going to be expended in this regard?
Mr. Speaker, the $2.2 million is not all the money we anticipate spending on the Principal affair.
Where's it?
Is that a was or is? Sure, supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. Is the Provincial Treasurer aware that the investors themselves are of the opinion that a public inquiry that is conducted in the public, unlike the Ombudsman's inquiry, and able to reach conclusions about the government's negligence, unlike the Code Inquiry, is not only preferable, but greatly preferable to either or both?
Mr. Speaker, I think we have explained. I think it's reasonable that I can explain again, because it does take some repetition for the members of the opposition to understand the process here. That in fact this is an inquiry set up under the court, headed by Mr. Code, is in fact a public inquiry. But where it does have additional strengths, Mr. Speaker, is in fact that Mr. Code has to report back to the court, and that should be known. So it is in fact unfair to say, or to leave the impression, that the principal investigation will not be done in public. In fact, it will.
Well, supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure that I'll ask the Treasurer if he recalls in his previous capacities here in the Assembly the expenditure of, in 1981 on the Brennan inquiry of some $214,000. That was a public inquiry. And the most expensive one to date, the Kavanaugh inquiry, public inquiry into the child welfare system conducted in 1980 at a cost of $611,000. Does he recall those instances of those expenses?
Mr. Speaker, I would be really stretching the credibility of the House and my own if I said I remember those expenditures. Of course I do not, Mr. Speaker.
Well, final supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. Will the provincial treasurer, in the best interests of properly spending Alberta taxpayers' dollars, now suggest to his colleagues in Cabinet that the more efficient procedure to follow from here on in is to establish a proper, full, open public inquiry which is not limited in its scope of questioning or conclusions, which would give them twice the useful results at perhaps half the cost?
Mr. Speaker, again, only to clarify what in fact is the process. We would not want to leave any impression that this process is not one which is open and public, because of course we have made the point over and over again, and have made it just recently, that in fact it is a public inquiry. As others have indicated, the investigator, Mr. Code, who has been appointed by the court, who must report publicly back to the court, has the right to subpoena witness, to call testimony, and to go back to the court itself to seek additional direction or to subpoena additional documents if in fact necessary. All this, Mr. Speaker, is in the range of public inquiry. It will be done in a public way, but there will be an opportunity here for everyone to appear who wishes. And as a matter of fact, today I just received word that I will be in fact called to testify on behalf of and to give the government's view on this. With respect to the expenditures, Mr. Speaker, let me make it very clear that because we wanted to get this process underway, because we were encouraged by the response from the contract holders themselves who want to get this process underway as well, that we put in place immediately $2 million special warrant. Now, we don't intend that that's the total amount of money which will be used. We expect that more will be required. And as the Premier has pointed out, Mr. Speaker, because our commitment is so significant and so vast, in terms of paying not just for the code inquiry, but for paying for the special counsel and for paying for the committee itself, but also, Mr. Speaker, for paying for part of the cost of liquidating those two companies, which will amount to millions of dollars and which essentially will go into the hands of the contract holders and the creditors themselves, that is a significant dollar commitment. Obviously, Mr. Speaker, those numbers are not now revealed to us because they haven't been calculated. When they are revealed and when they're there, we'll make those payments, and it'll be a very significant cost to all Albertans.
Supplementary question, Calgary Buffalo.
Thank you to the Minister. The Ombudsman has stated that in his letter of October 16th that he has doubts with respect to the ability of Mr. Code to make conclusions with respect to the government's regulatory process. Is the Minister aware of any basis for the Ombudsman's statement?
The difficulty is that the original line of questioning is with regard to costs. It's not a matter of the interpretation of regulations, so therefore the question shouldn't be answered. Main question, Leader of the Liberal Caucus.
Mr. Speaker, maybe before I get underway, I have a bit of a problem, as you probably well recall yesterday. The biggest problem's over there, I know, but as you probably recall yesterday, you ruled most of my questions out of order, and then at your request, I sent you a written list of the questions, and you very kindly sent me yesterday, or last night, the information that I could ask two of them. So therefore, I think, Mr. Speaker, I have 2 points. I'd like to ask those two, or I mean, the two I would which you had ruled out of order. I would like the Treasurer to answer those now. I can repeat them. And maybe also, Mr. Speaker, while we're at it, just a point of since that you
order, please. Order, please, in the whole House. The member's indeed raising a very important issue because we haven't a chance to engage in this process to allow how a written question which had been submitted to the chair may then be reintroduced in the next day. So it really isn't fair for other quarters of the House to be shouting down at this time, and I beg others. Please. Please, honourable member, you weren't here yesterday. I really just, perhaps you could wait half a moment. Congratulations. The process would be, honourable member for West Loch Sturgeon, that if you have another topic that you want to bring up as your lead question today, you could do that, or indeed you could refer back to the 2 questions out of the 5 submitted that are indeed in order. You can use those. It's your choice, but go.
My understanding is I can ask the 2 that I was ruled out of order yesterday, because you've now ruled them in order, then go on to my main question. But my other... Oh, wait a minute now. Mr. Speaker, you're a man of the cloth, and if you go back, you will check into chapter 25, the Gospel of St. Matthew. It says, I was a stranger, you took me in. I was a stranger, you took me in.
Order, please. Honourable member, thank you for bringing to attention one of my many previous occupations. The chair has suggested that the member can proceed with a new line of questions, and when that is finished, the chair will recognize the honourable member for West Loch Sturgeon for the 2 questions out of the 5 that were indeed in order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will raise it as a point of order at that time. Mr. Speaker, this is, of course, to the popular man of the hour, the provincial treasurer. Mr. Speaker, we are aware that over $14 billion worth of financial institutions have failed in Alberta. In the course of these failures, the government has committed from time to time over $1 billion in support and bailouts, yet has provided no leadership in assessing the causes for these failures or setting the stage for the future of Alberta's financial industry. To the provincial treasurer, could the treasurer please confirm that the government lost $125 million in the CCB and Northlands bank failures, lost $85 million in the preferred share designed to support Northwest Trust, and currently has $635 million at risk in the credit unions, and has lost $45 million in the Treasury branches last year? Is that your sad record of management?
Mr. Speaker, obviously questions of fact with respect to where we stand at CCB or Northlands, or what our exposure may well be in terms of dollar amounts in any other financial institution, in my view, Mr. Speaker, seeking your advice here would be an appropriate matter for the order paper.
Well, Mr. Speaker, would the treasurer at least explain why, in spite of this colossal record of losses to the people of Alberta, and to the government, to the people of Alberta, there has not been any positive legislation or designed to develop a financial industry in this province? Not one positive bit of legislation has arisen out of these huge losses to date.
Mr. Speaker, I already gave some indication earlier on in this fall session that it was clearly our intention to bring forward legislation in the spring of 1988 which would reflect the contemporary issues of those questions involving financial institutions. More specifically, we'll be dealing with the trust company legislation, and certainly, Mr. Speaker, we'll be dealing with the credit union legislation. That was on our normal course of legislative programming for the Treasury Department, and we will obviously adhere to that schedule, and will, wherever possible, to the best of our ability, reflect the recommendations flowing from the code investigation.
Mr. Speaker, this is fantastic. It's hard to believe. Ever since Dow Mortgage's management scuttled off and hid in the Premier's office, these things have been going haywire in this province. Now he says he's thinking about it. Can you give us any suggestion what policies or ideas he's going to put forward that will ensure that these things will not occur again in the future?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's that kind of centralist notion where government intervention dictates to the private sector that would only give that kind of assurance. What we've experienced here in Alberta, of course, has been a significant erosion of asset values, primarily because of real estate devaluations over the past period from 1983 through to 1986, primarily in 86, driven by oil prices. As a result of that, Mr. Speaker, there has been a serious erosion in asset values, and that's caused the problem. But the problem, Mr. Speaker, is not unique just to Alberta. It should be known that in Canada as well, the major banks have lost a significant amount of money only because of their larger capitalization and perhaps their larger age have been able to sustain those losses. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, significant losses in the financial sector in the United States has occurred, particularly Texas, particularly the United States, where well over 200 banks have failed. So To argue that it's unique to Alberta is improper, Mr. Speaker. To argue that we're doing nothing about it is wrong, Mr. Speaker. And to argue that we are not concerned about it is certainly misleading, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, one injury, an accident, maybe two going under, it's the accident, but when you have 9 to 10 institutions going under, it has to be something wrong with the government. Could the Treasurer, now that he suggested they're coming forward with a new legislation, could he go this far? Tell us how he could possibly come forward with new legislation without opening it up for public review or public hearings to hear what the people of Alberta would like to see in the type of financial industry that they want to see designed in the future.
Well, Mr. Speaker, to suggest that we have not had public input is again wrong, and it's the kind of misrepresentation that is commonly found from across the way from the Liberal Party. What we have been doing, Mr. Speaker, clearly, and one example only is with respect to the credit unions, we have circulated draft working papers with respect to how we expect to move with the credit union legislation. That has been received, it's been debated and considered, and obviously be reflected in legislation which is proposed here. We're also bringing forth a series of recommendations which will be considered by the private sector as well, and that obviously be reflected in our legislation. That's the common policy of this government. That's the way in which we operate. Right now, for example, there are two key pieces of legislation which are out for public debate, the Labour Act and the School Act. And you can see clearly, Mr. Speaker, that our intention, our plan, our commitment is to seek public input wherever possible, and we're doing that in a variety of ways.
Supplementary on this question, Edmonton Highlands.
Mr. Speaker, yes, the supplementary to the provincial treasurer is this. Given that the then Consumer and Corporate Affairs Minister had a document prepared by her department on exactly this issue in 1983, can he explain why it is that the government waited for yet more collapses to occur before changing the regulations?
Again, Mr. Speaker, I'm not too sure of the authenticity of that statement, and therefore I can't comment on it.
Chair recognize Edmonton Highlands. With respect to yesterday's unfinished business, Westlock Sturgeon, 2 questions. Principal.
Can I bring my point of order beside the question, or could we do it at the end of the... This has to do when I bring the question period up. Of order, then we can take up at the end of the question period then? Okay. Yes. The question for the Treasurer is that in a matter of public record that the 2 months after the Treasurer decided to dissolve First and Associated Investors of Canada, the principal group mutual funds were sold for a net value of about $15 million. It's also true that the same mutual funds were valued at between 120 and 140 the previous year by Wood Gundy. Prospectus approved by the Alberta Securities Commission. The first question, as you had approved here, and I'm going to read it so that there's no question of straying at all from your edict. Did the Treasurer consider action on June the 30th that might have preserved the value of these mutual funds and other elements of the principal group, which could then have been made available to support the investments of First and Associated Investors?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not at all uncomfortable with this question, but I might, I'm not trying to take away any of the responsibility of the House Leader, but in looking at your comments, Mr. Speaker, on page 1983, with respect to these written questions, you have indicated that it would be appropriate to have them submit written questions for the order paper, Mr. Speaker. Those are your words. I haven't seen them on the order paper. I stand corrected.
Provincial Treasurer, that was indeed the import of the first set of remarks that were made on Monday, but in due course, as followed up later in the day, yesterday, it was pointed out that the matter could be submitted in written form for examination by the table officers as a second alternative approach. So that one is to do it to the written question for the order paper, which in that way then there's no discussion or it lessens the amount of frustration about questions being moved in or out, ruled in order or out of order in the course of question period. And so yesterday we did indeed say that there were 2 routes. Submission of questions to the table officers, which indeed has been carried out, and the response was made. And so if perhaps the Provincial Treasurer could proceed on this question in that line, please. Reread, that could also be done because of this exchange. Would the Honourable Member for Westlock Sturgeon just reread the question, please?
To the Treasurer. I've never seen him at a loss for words, and I'm almost as a loss for words to be able to repeat it. Did the Treasurer consider action on June the 30th, that's 1987, that may have preserved the value of these mutual funds and other elements of the principal group, which could then have been made available to support the investments of First and Associated Investors.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not at all comfortable with that question. First of all, because it would require some careful and perhaps extended explanation by me as to the relationship between the contract companies and, in fact, the not so much the mutual fund companies, but the management company that owns the mutual fund companies. To make the kinds of suggestions which are being made here is, in fact, in error in my view. And therefore, I can only say that with respect to the mutual fund company valuations, it is a question. Their value is not a question of what they're marketable for. It's a question of what their assets are and equal to the number of shares that are outstanding. It's calculated every day, and that value is one which is a publicly recorded number.
The Treasurer blew it, and he knew it. Will the Treasurer explain why he did not adopt the procedure utilized in the United States, whereby government could have moved in and managed a financial corporation, thus sustaining its value, and to avoid the loss of First and Associated Investors?
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, the connection between the mutual fund business and the contract companies is not, in fact, a direct connection. Again, I must be very careful here, because I'm sure this will be the essence of the Code inquiry. But in providing an explanation, I should say that what was at the heart here was the need to protect the integrity of that group, hoping that at some point it could be sold or the entity itself could be sold. That was the broad side of our policy, but at the same time we had to balance that with the fact that the losses, at the time I made some public comments about my view of the losses, those will now be calculated by the various receivers. Nonetheless, those losses will have to be borne by the citizens of Alberta, the general taxpayers of Alberta, and that was the balance between the two positions.
Supplementary, Littlebow?
No, sir.
Main question, member for Littlebow.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Agriculture, and I'd like to ask questions on behalf of an investor group in this province that are also producers, the farmers of the province of Alberta. The federal finance minister has before him a proposal to impose a modified accrual system of accounting on the farmers of Alberta. The farmers, we as farmers, were not consulted about that proposal. My question to the minister is, was the minister consulted prior to the presentation of the June 18th, 1987 white paper that was made available to Albertans or to Canadians?
No, Mr. Speaker, I was not consulted, and the Honourable Provincial Treasurer has also had discussions with the Minister of Finance, so he might wish to supplement this.
Speaker, with respect to taxation of farms and farmers, the province of Alberta, the government of Alberta, has taken a very strong stand opposed to the recommendations in the white paper, arguing that to make these kinds of adjustments at this time when the farming community is under some stress would be inappropriate. And personally, I made the very strong argument, Mr. Wilson, that the accrual accounting system, for example, is inappropriate, that the rules applied to startup farmers are not good, and in fact the offset of losses against other income would in fact be very detrimental to the farming agricultural sector, and we have made a very strong case on that point.
Speaker, supplementary then to the Provincial Treasurer. Could the Minister indicate whether that presentation was a written presentation, and has it been made public? I don't think the farmers of Alberta are too aware of that at this time.
We have had some written correspondence between Mr. Wilson, but now that the parliamentary committee has made its recommendations available, I believe on November the 16th, we will now make a formal presentation in written form to Mr. Wilson, and that'll be going the next day or so.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the Minister, could the Minister indicate whether the Minister will be personally making representation besides sending this missile or edict to Ottawa? Will be on a personal basis, and would the Minister take to report back to this House the success of that representation?
Mr. Speaker, I'd be glad to do that. First of all, on November the 5th, we made a very strong case with respect to the way in which the white paper was treating taxation of farmers. We will now follow that up with a written position subject, at least subsequent to the Glencairn Committee, And moreover, Mr. Speaker, I believe on December the 10th, I will again be meeting with Mr. Wilson to discuss this issue, and will take the advice of my honourable colleague from Little Bow and make a very strong pointed statement, and then we'll report back to the Assembly at some appropriate time as to what his perceived response may have been.
Supplementary for the supplement. Vegreville, followed by Westlock Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the provincial treasurer, and I'm glad that he read my press release describing what would certainly be a farmer's nightmare and an accountant's dream. I'm wondering, along with those recommendations, is something concerning a definition of a so-called hobby farmer. And that often is young farmers who find it necessary to work off the farm in order to supplement their income. Is it this government's intention to advance a more reasonable definition of that class of farmer, or are you prepared to not discriminate against farmers in any way in terms of federal and provincial income tax proposals?
First of all, Mr. Speaker, I can assure you that we don't take our lead from NDP press releases. We are far out in front of this issue. We have taken hold of this issue some time. In concert with the Minister of Agriculture and other members of our caucus, we have taken the strong position opposed to the policy of the federal government on this point. And we will maintain that position, Mr. Speaker. But I do agree, though, on the principle of the hobby farmer. As I indicated in my opening comments, I object to the way in which that's being handled, because in the 4-year period for the startup farm in particular, it's difficult to measure into the 5th years to that transition, and we would argue that the status quo should be maintained with respect to the farm tax rules, perhaps providing for larger tax loss offset against other income to allow for the off-farm opportunity to work to build up an equity and to maintain the family income. That's the general principles on which we're operating, Mr. Speaker.
Go back to the original question to the Minister of Agriculture. Just in case the Mulroney government does not listen to our Premier and his cabinet here, stranger things have happened, and they do go ahead with the accrual system of taxing farmers. In other words, taxing a farmer for what he has on the property. Could the Minister of Agriculture assure us that he will press to see legislation in place that we do not have federal income tax inspectors wandering around, invading the privacy of our farmers, assessing what they have in stock and inventory so that they can issue their tax notices?
Thank you, Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me indicate to the honourable member for Westlock Sturgeon and to members of the chamber that if they're not aware, they should be aware that there was a standing parliamentary committee that was also looking into the recommendations by the Minister of Finance at the federal level. They have come forward with some recommendations that are similar to the ones that have just been advocated by our provincial treasurer, and we're hoping that the federal finance minister will pay attention to his own caucus colleagues. We're going to make sure, and I will underscore simply what our provincial treasurer has indicated, we're going to continue, as we always have done in the past, to make strong representations in favor of our farming population.
Member for Olds, Didsbury. Next main question, followed by Vegreville.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Hospitals and Medicare. There are a number of nursing homes with heavy care patients who should be in auxiliary hospitals. Is the Minister willing to approve the conversion of nursing home beds to auxiliary beds?
Mr. Speaker, we've got about 20 requests or so from nursing homes across the province to convert beds to auxiliary hospital beds, and we're not able to approve those requests for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the funding levels required for auxiliary hospitals are about double that of nursing homes, and secondly, we currently have underway a long-term care committee report, which we believe will provide us with some new directions in how we fund both nursing homes and auxiliary hospitals. In the interim, however, we have announced some funding assistance for nursing homes with heavy care patients, wherein those who have patients assessed for auxiliary care that exceed 20% of the nursing home will receive an additional $19 per patient day to assist them until the long-term care committee report is finalized and adopted by our government, and until the patient classification system that's presently underway is completed.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister then give consideration to extending existing hospital facilities to accommodate auxiliary hospital care in areas such where such care is not presently available, such as in the town of Sundre?
On an annual basis, Mr. Speaker, we do consider a request for new auxiliary hospitals and nursing homes throughout the province. My expectation is that the Long-Term Care Committee will be recommending to us that we move toward identifying both auxiliary hospitals and nursing homes as long-term care facilities at which either nursing home patients or auxiliary patients can be accommodated, particularly in smaller communities like Sundre. It would therefore be our intention in years to come to be looking at building long-term care facilities that would accommodate both levels of patients, both nursing home and auxiliary hospital.
Edmonton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, on the patient classification and assessment pilot that the Department is doing, and we hope it will be completed soon, is it true that the Minister has indicated that even though it proves a better way of classifying patients at any level within the system, that he, for budgetary reasons, will not fund that better way of classifying patients so they can be appropriately placed?
None of the honourable member's remarks are true.
Next main question, Vegreville, followed by Calgary Buffalo, if there is time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Everyone is aware of just how serious a situation our grain farmers are facing, with prices being lower now than at any time since the 1930s. And one of the many negative effects of Mulroney's trade deal will be the elimination of the two-price system for wheat. And I'm wondering how this government can so enthusiastically support an agreement that will take $300 million a year out of the nearly empty pockets of grain farmers.
Mr. Speaker, we saw a news release come out from the New Democratic Party some time ago indicating the hypocritical stance that we had taken. Well, this is the height of hypocrisy that we're hearing from the honourable member for Vegreville, because if he isn't aware, he should be, that Charlie Mayer, the minister responsible for the Canadian Wheat Board, indicated that he was going to see that that benefit was maintained for our wheat growers, even though the two-price wheat system itself was going to be changed as it relates to its present circumstance. But the actual cash injection was going to be maintained. Mr. Speaker, in addition to that, we recognize the importance that agriculture does play to this province, and if one examines what we consume as to what we produce, and if we erect a barrier around this province, we have to get rid of 50% of our farming population. And surely that's not what the New Democratic Party is advocating.
Mr. Speaker, if it isn't broken, why fix it? What is the rationale for seeking to get rid of the import license restrictions on wheat, oats, and barley that would undo the two-price system for wheat and be a direct loss of $300 million, and then turn around and say you're going to give them $300 million back? What is the motive here?
Hear, hear.
The motive, Mr. Speaker, is to make sure that we have direct access to our largest trading partner. We want to make sure, and the honourable members...
Please, honourable minister. Chair will allow the minister to continue when there's a bit more chance for the rest of the people in the Assembly to hear what the answer is. Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's obvious they don't want to hear the truth. But we want to make sure that we have continued and secured access to the U.S. markets, which play such an instrumental part to this province, whereby we've shipped close to $400 million worth of agricultural products during the year of 1986 to the U.S. market. The honourable member is aware of the non-tariff items they've introduced as it relates to the hog industry. We want to make sure that we continue to have access for our red meat industry. We feel overall, as is the case with the major grain producers as it relates to their organizations, the Alberta Wheat Pool has suggested that they are supportive of this agreement, as has the United Grain Growers suggested they are supportive of it, Mr. Speaker, so I'm somewhat confused by the statements of the honourable member.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we'll deal with and dismiss the myth of guaranteed access in another question period, because that's certainly not the case. But we're talking about grain here, and I'm wondering...
Please order. Let us go to the supplementary question.
The Minister can tell the Assembly if the limited opportunities for increased imports of wheat, oats, and barley into an already flooded U.S. market were the real reason for this part of the deal, Or were the Conservatives merely bowing to pressure from millers and feedlot operators who want access to even cheaper grain than they already do?
Mr. Speaker, as has been the tradition of the honourable member since I've been associated with him in the House, it's an actual distortion of the facts, which he's so good at doing, whereby, as I indicated, the Alberta Wheat Pool, who are very instrumental in the grain production cycle within this province, as has the United Grain Growers. They would contradict the statements by the honourable member, recognizing the importance of this agreement not only to our grain producers, but to our red meat producers, and more importantly to our further processing sector within the province.
Can the minister tell us what this government's response was to action taken by the Americans only days after the deal was signed to offer extra import incentives to our traditional customers to take markets away from our grain farmers?
Mr. Speaker, that underscores the importance of having an agreement with the United States whereby we do not have those hindrances to our traditional partners, because part of the agreement has been that they will not use extra incentives to undermine our traditional markets. That's part of the agreement. That's why we want to have this agreement signed, and it's interesting to note that, again, this group across the way are attempting to hinder our agricultural sector within this province, and if they want to have any type of understanding, all one has to do, Mr. Speaker, is look at the results in the Chinook by-election.
The member for Little Bow, followed by Vermilion Viking.
Supplementary question to the Minister of Agriculture in terms of clarification in regards to markets and the free trade proposed agreement as established by this document that was circulated by the Government of Canada. My question, Mr. Speaker, to the Honourable Minister, recent subsidized grain sales by the United States to traditional Canadian markets seem to be inconsistent with the preliminary text of this agreement. And I'd like to quote the section of the agreement that I believe is inconsistent, where it says, each party has agreed to take into account the export interest of the other party in the use of any export subsidy on agricultural goods exported to third countries, and that's outside of the continent, recognizing that such subsidies may be have prejudicial effects on the export interests of the other party. Now, my understanding is that because of the subsidies in the United States, it could have affected our Canadian grain sales. Could the minister indicate what assurances he has had that that won't happen, and that under this agreement and under these terms that the subsidies will not affect us in Canada?
It's written into the agreement.
Mr. Speaker, let me indicate part of the reason why we are so supportive of the agreement is simply because of what has happened in the past with the subsidy war that has taken place between the U.S. and the European Economic Community, whereby it has had a disastrous impact on our Canadian farmers, and our Alberta farmers are not exempt from that, and they do recognize that that has caused the difficulties. And we don't have the resources that both of those communities do have to offer support, even though we have been very forthcoming with our support both at the federal and provincial level. I should share with the members, I indicated to the honourable member for Vegreville, that is why we wish the agreement signed and concluded, so that those provisions will be recognized, they're written into the agreement, so that we will have that assurance that they will not undermine our traditional markets.
Vermilion Viking was recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Agriculture, supplemental. In view of the fact that the two-price system on milling grains only affected 5.5% of the production in Alberta, and that it has been detrimental to the development of processing in this province because of the access to markets and the low population in Western Canada, could you indicate if you are going to make overtures, if free trade goes ahead, to see that value-added processing will be accessed in the province in the the breakfast cereals and milling type industries in this province.
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member is aware, we've placed an added emphasis on further market development and research development within the province as our third thrust within the agricultural sector, and we're going to continue to do that, whether it be the cereal industry or the meatpacking industry. We wish to see more jobs maintained within our province because we recognize the benefit it not only has for the agricultural community, but for all Albertans in general.
Time for question period has expired. The chair would just make note of the fact that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 members were left waiting in the wings today. There was one point of order raised during question period. Member for Westlock Sturgeon.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, it's with respect to the being allowed to ask questions the next day that had been submitted the day earlier in writing, provided they've been disallowed, as what happened today, in which I thank you for the chance and the way you solved the problem for today. But it does set in motion, Mr. Speaker, a problem in the order of business of the House. I would respectfully suggest that any questioner whose questions have been declared out of order on the day they asked the question, then later portions of it declared in order, should be at the top of the question period before the official leader of the opposition or anyone asked, because otherwise those questions could be preempted by the questioners that come before. In other words, if you're not automatically the leader of the opposition, and your questions could then be preempted by earlier questioners. It seems to me, Mr. Speaker, I would like you to think about it or rule on it, that the two questions, or the questions that have been ruled out of order, then subsequently ruled in order, should move to the very top of the order in the question period, so that they couldn't be preempted by someone else.
On this particular point of order.
This would be rather an unusual process in British parliamentary democracy. If the Liberals want to be the official opposition, they'll have to earn it, Mr. Speaker, not come out of the side. Mr. Speaker, this is an unusual position. I think you've been more than fair even allowing 2 extra questions, which took more. But to now say that they come ahead of our traditional procedures in this legislature, I think is carrying it a little far, Mr. Speaker.
You should talk to his House Leader.
Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, without getting into this particular debate very far, but on the point of order, there is an expression being used in the exchanges here, and I would, when you rule, seek your clarification. My understanding was that if a question, in your opinion, touched upon the principal affair in a doubtful manner, and you were at that point not ruling it out of order, but rather reserving judgment on it, subject to receiving a written statement of the question in which you would respond back. And we're hearing here that questions are ruled out of order when I think that isn't technically quite the way I understand the ruling. So perhaps you would clarify that point as well, Mr. Speaker, when you render a decision upon the matter in debate between the Leader of the Opposition and the Leader of the Liberal Party.
On this particular point of order.
Speaker, it would seem to me that far from being allowed 2 sets of questions, which is what happened today with the honourable member from Westlock Sturgeon, that he should have to decide whether he wants to take those 2 questions which were left over from yesterday and add a couple to it and make that his series, or else do another series, but not. Well, that's just exactly what you were trying to do, was take advantage of the rule, and he was more than fair to you, and you're not satisfied with it.
This is not a shouting match, honourable members.
More than fair to him, and he's complaining it wasn't fair enough, is what I'm saying.
The member for Clover Bar, on the point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I take also umbrage with you saying that I wasn't here. I can read, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the point that really I think we're discussing is you are ruling the question in order or out of order. And once that decision was made that it was in order, then the member carries on his usual manner. And so really, that doesn't mean that you get 2 questions or 4 questions. All you made the decision on is if it's in order or out of order. And then you have given the member permission to ask the question, therefore he goes ahead in a normal procedure.
Goes off. I can see that.
Honourable member, no. We have had irregular procedure in the House with respect to points of order. The usual practice is the aggrieved members or other members who are giving advice to the chair speak once and once only. It's not a situation for summing up. We deviated from that position on Monday because of the complicated issue, but this is much more of a procedural nature with regard to the operation of the House. The chair also can cut the debate off at any time because it's a matter of private advice from the members to the chair, basically with other interested parties listening in. Yesterday, the chair pointed out that another way to be dealing with the matter, other suggestions may well come forward. The chair yesterday pointed out that there was an invitation to the House leaders of all political persuasions in the House to meet together, reach a consensus, and then come and have discussion with the chair. The chair has not been advised of any such process at this time, and therefore the chair has had to make the arrangements which were in place today, and it's obvious that it hasn't satisfied all members. But until some direction comes which shows consensus from all corners of the House, the chair perforce will continue that when questions have been submitted and that the chair has decided to reserve judgment, that the present practice will continue because the House was indeed very generous today to the member for West Loch Sturgeon to allow the initial set of questions and then to be able to carry on with the other questions which had indeed been regarded as being in order. And so it is appropriate to say that judgment was reserved and that some questions were in order and others were not. And the chair appreciates the fact that the member for West Loch Sturgeon did indeed supply the chair with the questions so that we had, table officers had a chance to properly vet what the process was. And again, with respect to all members of the House, we know it's a difficult thing and to try to assess properly the process. And it does indeed take up more time than the question period, and the chair apologizes to honourable members, but nevertheless it's one way that together we're able to work through a very difficult, contentious issue, if you will. Finally, the chair would point out to the honourable member for Clover Bar that the chair was in error to make any comment about the member's presence or absence in the House on any occasion, and the chair apologizes. The chair also apologized by note previously in question period. And again, the chair did not at any time impute that the honourable member could not read. Not at all. Orders of the day.
Clarification, if I may.
But let's say point of order.
For clarification. What we're talking about specifically here with this special procedure is simply the principal matter. It's not any other aspect of the House, just for point of clarification.
It's absolutely honourable Leader of the Opposition, indeed. Orders of the day.
Government motions. Motion number 7.